The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Morrison's weathered face as he rode along the dry creek bed, searching for strays from his cattle ranch. The summer of 1889 had been the worst drought in living memory, and every water source for 50 miles had turned to cracked mud and broken dreams. Jake pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare. At 34, he'd spent half his life in this harsh country, building his ranch from nothing with his bare hands and stubborn determination. The drought was killing him slowly. He'd lost 40 head of cattle in the past month alone, and his water reserves were running dangerously low. His horse, a sturdy roan named Copper, snorted and shied away from something ahead. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle strapped to his saddle. In this territory, anything that spooked a horse could mean trouble. Apache raiders, mountain lions, or worse. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, urging Copper forward. "Let's see what's got you worried." What he found made his blood run cold. A small figure lay crumpled in the meager shade of a dying mesquite tree. Apache, by the look of the clothing, but not a warrior. Jake dismounted slowly, his rifle ready, scanning the surrounding rocks and cacti for signs of an ambush. The Apaches were at war with the settlers, and Jake had lost friends to their raids. But as he approached, he realized this was no threat. It was a girl, maybe 12 years old, unconscious and burning with fever. Her dark hair was matted with sweat, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She wore a traditional Apache dress, now torn and dust-covered, and a small medicine bag hung from her neck. Jake knelt beside her, his rancher's instincts taking over. He doctored sick cattle and horses enough times to recognize the signs of severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. The girl was dying, and she didn't have long. "Jesus," he whispered, touching her forehead. Her skin was like fire, yet she was shivering. Without thinking, he uncapped his canteen and carefully dribbled water between her parched lips. The girl's eyes fluttered open, dark, intelligent eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. She looked at him with confusion and fear, trying to pull away despite her weakness. "Easy, little one," Jake said softly, though he knew she probably didn't understand English. "I'm not going to hurt you." He looked around the desolate landscape, trying to piece together what had happened. There were tracks in the dust, many horses, moving fast. A raiding party, probably, fleeing from the cavalry. In their haste to escape, they'd left behind anyone who couldn't keep up. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen the Apache way of war, swift, brutal, and without mercy for weakness. But abandoning a sick child to die alone in the desert? That was something else entirely. The girl tried to sit up, pointing weakly toward the distant mountains and speaking in Apache. Jake caught one word he recognized: family. She was trying to tell him where her people had gone. Jake studied the terrain she was pointing toward. The Dragoon Mountains, maybe 30 miles away. Rough country, full of hidden canyons and Apache strongholds. Even with a good horse and full water supplies, it would be a dangerous journey. On foot, in this heat, it would be suicide. But as he looked down at the girl's fevered face, Jake made a decision that would change everything. "All right, little one," he said, gently lifting her in his arms. "Let's get you home." He carefully placed her on Copper's back, using his bedroll to cushion her against the saddle. The horse stood perfectly still, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Jake tied his rope around the girl's waist and the saddle horn to keep her from falling, then gave her his canteen. "Drink slowly," he said, demonstrating with gestures. "Small sips." The girl managed a weak smile and whispered something in Apache. Jake didn't understand the words, but he recognized gratitude when he heard it. He looked toward the distant mountains, then at his horse and the dying girl. 30 miles, on foot, in the desert heat, with Apache warriors who might shoot him on sight, even if he was trying to help. Jake Morrison had always prided himself on being a practical man, but sometimes being practical meant doing something that looked crazy to everyone else. He took Copper's reins and started walking toward the mountains, leading his horse and its precious cargo into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his boots were starting to rub blisters on his feet. He'd been walking for 3 hours, leading Copper through the increasingly rough terrain as the girl drifted in and out of consciousness. The desert was a furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the rocks, creating phantom lakes that disappeared as soon as you looked directly at them. Jake's mouth felt like sandpaper, but he'd given most of his water to the girl. She needed it more than he did. "How you doing up there, little one?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't understand him. The sound of his own voice was oddly comforting in the vast silence. The girl stirred, managing to lift her head slightly. Her fever had broken an hour ago, and some color was returning to her cheeks. She looked down at Jake with those intelligent dark eyes, and he could see her trying to understand why a white man was walking through the desert to save her life. Jake's ranch was now far behind them, invisible in the heat haze. He'd probably lost more cattle while he was gone, and his foreman Bill would be wondering where the hell he was. But looking at the girl's face, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. The terrain was getting more difficult. They were climbing now, following ancient Apache trails that wound between towering saguaro cacti and fields of beryl cactus. Jake's legs were starting to ache, and his lungs burned with each breath of the superheated air. Around noon, they reached a small plateau where a cluster of rocks provided some shade. Jake called a halt, helping the girl down from the horse so she could rest properly. She was much stronger now, able to sit up on her own, though she still clung to the canteen. "What's your name?" Jake asked, pointing to himself. Jake Morrison." The girl looked at him for a moment, then touched her chest. "Ayana," she said softly. It was the first word she'd spoken that he could understand. "Ayana," Jake repeated, and she nodded. "That's a pretty name." She pointed toward the mountains and spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice growing stronger with each word. Jake caught a few words: grandfather, medicine man, safe. She was telling him about her family, about where they were going. Jake studied the terrain ahead. The mountains looked closer now, but he knew that was an illusion. They still had at least 20 miles to cover, and the worst part of the journey was yet to come. The trail would lead them through narrow canyons and across exposed ridges where Apache scouts might be watching. But there was something else bothering him. Apache war parties didn't usually travel with children, especially sick ones, and the tracks he'd seen back at the creek bed were all wrong for a raiding party. Too many horses, too much baggage. "Ayana," he said, pointing to the mountains. "Your people, not warriors. Families." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded vigorously. She spoke again, gesturing with her hands, and Jake began to understand. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a group of families fleeing from something, probably cavalry, or maybe civilian militia, and in their panic to escape, they'd left behind anyone who couldn't keep up, including a sick 12-year-old girl. Jake felt anger building in his chest. He'd fought Apache raiders, buried neighbors killed in their attacks, and he had no illusions about the brutality of the frontier war. But abandoning a child to die alone in the desert was something else entirely. "Well, Ayana," he said, standing up and checking Kappa's gear. "Looks like we've got some walking to do." The girl struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. She was still weak, but determined. She pointed to the horse and then to Jake, shaking her head. She was trying to tell him to ride, that she could walk. Jake smiled and gently helped her back onto Copper. "Not a chance, little one. I've got 2 good legs, and you're still sick. Besides," he added, patting the horse's neck, "Copper here likes you better than me anyway." As they resumed their journey, Jake noticed storm clouds building on the horizon. Rain would be a blessing if it reached them, but desert storms were tricky things, often dumping their water miles away from where you needed it most. The afternoon wore on, and Jake's world narrowed to the simple rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. His boots were definitely giving him blisters now, and his legs felt like lead. But every time he looked up at Ayana, sitting straighter in the saddle with each passing hour, he found the strength to keep going. They were climbing steadily now, following a narrow trail that wound between massive boulders. The air was slightly cooler at this elevation, but the terrain was more treacherous. One wrong step could mean a fall that would kill them both. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Jake spotted movement ahead. He stopped, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, then relaxed as he realized what he was seeing. Apache scouts, watching them from the high rocks. They'd been seen. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he spotted the Apache scouts positioned on the rocky outcroppings above them. 3 figures, maybe 4, perfectly still against the desert stone. They'd probably been watching for the past hour, invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. Ayanna had seen them too. She sat straighter in the saddle, calling out in Apache. Her voice was stronger now, carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Jake didn't understand the words, but he caught the urgent tone. She was identifying herself, explaining her situation. One of the scouts replied, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ayanna gesturing toward Jake and speaking rapidly. Jake stood perfectly still, his hands visible and away from his weapons. One wrong move here would get him filled with arrows before he could blink. Finally, Ayanna turned to him. "Grandfather," she said in English, pointing toward the mountains. "He comes." Jake nodded, understanding. The scouts had sent word ahead, and someone was coming to meet them. The question was whether that someone would be grateful for Jake's help or angry that he'd intruded on Apache territory. They waited in the growing shadows of evening, the desert cooling around them. Jake's legs ached from the long walk, and his lips were cracked despite the water he'd managed to drink. But Ayanna looked remarkably better, alert, responsive, and definitely out of immediate danger. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Jake counted at least 6 riders, moving fast. He helped Ayanna down from Copper and stepped slightly in front of her, not as a shield, but as a sign that he was responsible for her safety. The Apache riders appeared around a bend in the trail, and Jake's breath caught. These weren't scouts or young warriors. These were seasoned fighters, men whose faces held the hard lines of countless battles. At their head rode an elderly man, whose presence commanded immediate respect. The old man, clearly the grandfather Ayanna had mentioned, dismounted and walked slowly toward them. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing as he took in the scene. The white rancher who'd walked miles through the desert, the healthy-looking girl, and the horse that had carried her to safety. Ayanna ran to her grandfather, speaking rapidly in Apache. The old man listened, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake with an intensity that made the rancher's skin crawl. Finally, the grandfather spoke. His English was accented but clear. "You are Jake Morrison. You have ranch near Willow Creek." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded, wondering how the old man knew about him. "You found my granddaughter dying in the desert. You gave her your horse and walked 30 miles to bring her home." 27 miles, Jake corrected automatically, then felt foolish. "But yes, sir. She needed help." The grandfather stepped closer, and Jake could see the pain in his ancient eyes. "The soldiers came 3 days ago. We had to run fast, very fast. Some of our people." He paused, the weight of difficult decisions heavy in his voice. "Some could not keep up." "You left her to die," Jake said, and immediately regretted the accusation in his tone. The old man's face hardened. "You think we wanted to abandon our children? You think it was easy to leave behind the sick and weak? The soldiers were coming, and if we stopped, we all die." Jake felt shame wash over him. He'd been so quick to judge, so ready to see cruelty where there had been impossible choices. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand. My granddaughter tells me you gave her your water. You walked in the desert sun without food or rest. You brought her home when you could have left her to die." The grandfather's voice softened slightly. "Why?" Jake looked at Ayanna, who was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. "Because she's a child," he said simply, "and children don't deserve to die alone in the desert." The grandfather nodded slowly. "You are not what I expected from a white rancher." "And you're not what I expected from an Apache chief," Jake replied. For the first time, the old man smiled. "I am not a chief. I am a grandfather and a medicine man. My name is Joseph Crow Feather. And you, Jake Morrison, have saved more than just one life today." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "My granddaughter is not just any child. She is the daughter of our war leader, and she has the gift of seeing. Our people believe she will be important to our future." Crow Feather gestured toward the other warriors. These men were ready to ride into the desert to die looking for her. Your kindness has prevented much bloodshed. Jake felt the weight of unintended consequences. He'd simply tried to save a sick child, but his actions had prevented a desperate rescue mission that would have likely ended in tragedy. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Crow Feather looked at the darkening sky. "Now you rest. Tomorrow, we escort you back to the edge of our territory, and we remember that there are good people on both sides of this war." As the Apache warriors set up a simple camp in the shelter of the rocks, Jake realized that his long walk through the desert had been about more than just saving one girl's life. It had been about proving that humanity could survive even in the midst of hatred and conflict. But the real test was yet to come. Dawn broke over the Apache camp with the soft light of early morning, painting the desert rocks in shades of gold and red. Jake woke to find Ayanna sitting beside him, carefully tending to the blisters on his feet with traditional Apache medicine. Her grandfather watched approvingly from nearby. "She says you have the feet of a warrior now," Crow Feather translated with a slight smile. "Walking 30 miles in the desert earns respect, even from our young people." Jake winced as Ayanna applied some kind of cooling salve to his worst blisters. The medicine worked immediately, numbing the pain and bringing blessed relief. "Tell her thank you," he said, "and tell her she's a good doctor." As Ayanna worked, Jake noticed the subtle changes in the camp around him. The Apache warriors who had watched him with suspicion the night before now nodded respectfully when he met their eyes. Children who had hidden behind their mothers now peeked out curiously, whispering among themselves about the white man who had saved their medicine girl. After a breakfast of dried meat and Apache corn bread, Crow Feather approached Jake with a serious expression. "There is something you must know before you return to your ranch. The soldiers who chased us, they are not finished. They plan to attack all Apache camps in this territory." Jake's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" "We have friends among the Apache scouts who work for the army. They send word when they can." Crow Feather's face was grim. "The colonel wants to finish what he calls the Apache problem before winter comes." "What are you going to do?" "We will run again. Find new hiding places. Try to keep our people alive until this madness passes." The old man's voice carried the weight of countless such flights. "But running is not living. Our children grow up knowing only fear and hunger." Jake looked around the camp at the faces of the Apache families, exhausted parents, hungry children, elders who had seen too much loss. These weren't the savage raiders he'd been taught to fear. They were people trying to survive in a world that had turned against them. What if there was another way? Jake asked quietly. Crow Feather studied him carefully. "What are you thinking?" "My ranch. It's remote, hard to find unless you know the way. There are hidden canyons, natural springs, good grazing land." Jake's mind was racing, the idea forming as he spoke. "If some of your people needed a place to hide, to rest and heal, you would hide Apache families on your land? Risk your own life to protect people who are supposed to be your enemies?" Jake looked at Ayanna, who was listening intently even though she couldn't understand the English words. "Yesterday, I walked 30 miles to save one Apache girl. Today, I'm offering sanctuary to her family. Maybe I'm just a fool, but it seems like the right thing to do." Crow Feather was quiet for a long moment, then called out in Apache. Several of the warriors gathered around, and a heated discussion began. Jake caught fragments, words of doubt, concern, and argument. Finally, the old medicine man raised his hand for silence. "They say it is too dangerous," he told Jake, "that the soldiers will come to your ranch and kill everyone they find there. They say you cannot be trusted because you are white." "And what do you say?" "I say that my granddaughter is alive because you walked 30 miles in the desert sun. I say that sometimes trust must begin with one person willing to take the first step." Crow Feather looked at his fellow Apache. "I say we should listen to this man's offer." The discussion continued for another hour, with voices raised in passionate debate. Jake waited patiently, understanding that he was asking these people to risk everything on the word of a stranger. Finally, a consensus seemed to emerge. "We will send 10 families," Crowfeather announced. "The oldest, the youngest, the sickest, those who cannot run anymore. They will come to your ranch and hide in your canyons until the soldiers stop hunting." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. 10 families, maybe 40 or 50 people. If they were discovered, everyone would die. The Apache families, Jake, and probably his ranch hands too. "When?" he asked. 3 days. We will send scouts first, to make sure it is safe. Then the families will come at night, moving in small groups so they are not seen. Jake nodded, then looked at Ayanna. "Will she be coming?" "Yes," Crowfeather said. "She is one of those who cannot run anymore. The sickness weakened her, and she needs time to recover her strength." As the Apache prepared to escort Jake back to the territorial boundary, Ayanna approached him with something in her hands. It was a small carved horse, made from smooth desert stone, with intricate Apache designs painted on its sides. "For you," she said in carefully pronounced English. "My horse now." Jake accepted the gift with reverence, understanding its significance. In giving her his horse, he had given her life. Now she was giving him this carved horse as a symbol of the bond between them. "Thank you, Ayanna," he said. "I'll treasure it always." As they prepared to leave, Crowfeather pulled Jake aside. "What you are doing is dangerous. If the soldiers find Apache families on your land, they will hang you as a traitor." "Then I guess we'd better not let them find anyone," Jake replied. The old medicine man smiled. "My granddaughter said you were brave. She was right." The journey back to the territorial boundary passed quickly, with Jake riding Copper, while Apache scouts ranged ahead and behind, invisible guardians ensuring safe passage. When they reached the edge of Apache territory, the moment of farewell was surprisingly difficult. 3 days, Crowfeather reminded him. "Watch for the signal fire on the eastern ridge. When you see it, you will know they are coming." Jake mounted Copper and looked back at the small group of Apache who had gathered to see him off. Ayanna sat on her grandfather's horse, looking healthier and stronger than she had when he'd found her dying in the desert. "Take care of yourself, little one," he called to her. "Take care of yourself, Jake Morrison," she replied, and he was amazed at how much her English had improved in just 2 days. As Jake rode toward home, he reflected on the past 3 days. He'd set out to find stray cattle, and instead found a dying child. He'd given his horse to an Apache girl and walked 30 miles through the desert. And now he was about to risk everything to hide Apache families on his ranch. His foreman, Bill, was going to think he'd lost his mind. The territorial authorities would consider him a traitor. His neighbors would probably run him out of the county. But when Jake looked at the carved horse in his saddlebags, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes being human meant taking risks that made no sense to anyone else. 3 days later, as Jake watched the signal fire burn on the eastern ridge, he smiled. Let them come. His ranch would be their sanctuary, and he would be their protector. The bridge of trust had been built, one step at a time, starting with a 30-mile walk through the desert to save a dying child. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Apache and white children play together in the yard. The hidden canyon on his property had become a permanent settlement, home to 3 Apache families who had nowhere else to go. Ayanna, now 17 and fluent in both English and Apache, worked as a translator and peacemaker, helping to resolve disputes between the Apache families and the white settlers in the area. She had indeed become important to her people's future, just as her grandfather had predicted. The carved horse she had given Jake sat on his mantelpiece, a reminder of the day he'd chosen to save a dying child instead of walking away. That choice had changed everything, not just for him, but for 2 communities that had learned to live in peace. Visitors from back east often asked Jake about his Apache problem, expecting stories of raids and violence. Instead, he told them about shared harvests, joint cattle drives, and children who grew up speaking 2 languages and understanding 2 cultures. "Weren't you afraid?" they always asked. Jake would smile and think about that long walk through the desert, about the trust that had been built one step at a time. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all, he would say. Sometimes you have to walk a few miles to find out who you really are. The Arizona Territory was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year. But in the hidden canyon of Jake Morrison's ranch, the old ways and the new ways lived side by side, proof that peace was possible when people chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. And it had all started with a man who gave his horse to a dying Apache girl and walked 30 miles through the desert to save her life.